Occupied France, August 1944. The war had turned, but no one inside the gray stone farmhouse knew it yet. Outside, rain dripped from the shattered roof beams of a town reduced to whispers and rubble. Inside, beneath a single hanging bulb, a young American soldier sat handcuffed to a chair. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with dirt and dried blood, but his eyes were steady. Across the table, a German officer watched him in silence. A half-smoked cigarette trembled between the officer's fingers, its ash stretching long and thin. Maps of the Normandy countryside lined the walls, red pins marking Allied positions, or what the Germans believed were Allied positions. A typewriter clicked somewhere in the corner, recording every word, every hesitation. The officer leaned forward. "Tell me," he said, his accent thick but controlled. "Where are your divisions moving next?" The American looked up, his voice quiet, almost disarming. "East," he said. Then he smiled. What the Germans didn't realize yet was that the man across the table was about to turn their entire operation against them. By the summer of 1944, the German war machine was crumbling but not yet broken. After the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Western Front had erupted into chaos. American, British, and Canadian divisions were pushing inland, fighting through hedgerows, villages, and fortified positions that turned every field into a battlefield. For the Germans, the invasion had torn open the Western Wall. Hitler's generals were desperate to understand where the Allies would strike next, whether they would break through to Paris, pivot north toward the Channel ports, or turn south to encircle retreating divisions. Intelligence more than bullets had become the weapon of survival. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, worked day and night to intercept Allied communications and interrogate prisoners of war. Every captured soldier represented an opportunity, a fragment of truth, a chance to glimpse the larger picture of Allied intentions. They believed that the key to stopping the Allies lay not in strength but in information. American units, on the other hand, were advancing faster than their supply lines could handle. Entire platoons became isolated in the French countryside. Paratroopers landed miles off target. Reconnaissance patrols disappeared behind enemy lines. Some of these men scattered, wounded, and out of contact ended up in German hands. The Germans called them valuable captives. To them, these weren't just prisoners. They were potential sources of gold military secrets wrapped in silence and fear. But the Americans had been trained for this. From the earliest days of the war, U.S. soldiers received instruction on how to handle capture. They were told name, rank, and serial number, nothing more. They learned that any additional detail, no matter how small, could cost lives. Still, the Germans were skilled interrogators. They didn't always use brute force. Many preferred psychological warfare manipulation, deception, exhaustion. They offered cigarettes, food, and warmth in exchange for conversation. They pretended to be sympathetic, to feign understanding, to make the prisoner drop his guard. In places like La Glaise, Saint-Lô, and Chartres, hundreds of POWs faced these tactics. Some resisted completely. Others slipped. But occasionally, very occasionally, a man did something unexpected. He didn't simply resist. He fought back with words, not weapons. That was the kind of man the Germans were now questioning in that farmhouse. An American soldier, recently captured after a failed patrol west of the Seine. His unit had been cut off during the Allied push toward Paris. Surrounded and wounded, he had been taken to a temporary field command where German intelligence officers were stationed. To the Germans, he was just another prisoner. To history, he would become something else entirely. His name was entered in a small ledger, his personal effects removed. He was interrogated 3 times in 24 hours. Each time he seemed to give them what they wanted, enough truth to be convincing, but never enough to be dangerous. He didn't yet know it, but the information he was about to surrender would ripple across the German command structure, changing orders, shifting divisions, and ultimately turning a local interrogation into a strategic disaster. Because in the war of minds, the first to believe is the first to lose. The German intelligence network in 1944 was stretched thin and under immense pressure. As the Allies advanced inland from Normandy, communication lines between frontline divisions and Berlin fractured. The Abwehr, once considered among the world's most sophisticated intelligence agencies, was losing both control and credibility. Reports conflicted, spies vanished, and the Gestapo often interfered, accusing officers of defeatism or treason. By July, Hitler himself had lost faith in his generals. He demanded concrete proof of Allied intentions, numbers, routes, targets. He wanted certainty in a war defined by chaos. That desperation trickled down through every command post, from Berlin's headquarters to small farmhouses now converted into makeshift interrogation centers scattered across occupied France. In those rooms, maps replaced family photographs, and the only sound besides rain or artillery was the clicking of typewriters. German officers had orders to extract any detail: the shape of a shoulder patch, the name of a commander, the color of supply trucks, because even fragments could reveal a pattern. They knew that the Americans were preparing their next major push. But where? The Falaise pocket was tightening. Thousands of German troops risked encirclement. Every captured soldier, every intercepted radio message, could shift the balance. And then came this prisoner, a lone American private, caught after a skirmish near Dreux. He had survived a wrecked jeep, crawled through hedgerows for 2 days, and surrendered only when ammunition ran out. His uniform showed he was part of an armored reconnaissance unit, exactly the kind of soldier who might know the movement of columns and supply lines. To the interrogators, that made him valuable. To the war itself, he would become dangerous. The Germans who questioned him were not the brutal caricatures history sometimes paints. They were intelligent men, trained in psychological warfare, educated in persuasion, and fluent in English. They began with civility, offering food, cigarettes, even conversation about home. They knew that the human mind, once made to feel safe, often betrays itself. But this prisoner didn't react the way they expected. He seemed calm, cooperative even. He answered questions with precision, giving short, believable replies that contained just enough fact to seem trustworthy and just enough falsehood to mislead. He didn't stonewall. He performed. Unbeknownst to them, his behavior mirrored the early techniques of counterintelligence resistance, later formalized into the SIRI, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape doctrines. These methods were still primitive in 1944, but soldiers were already briefed in deception: mislead, redirect, occupy time, sow doubt. The German officer leading the session, Hauptmann Erich Kessler, had interrogated dozens of Americans. Most either stayed silent or broke under fatigue. This one, however, seemed almost too willing to help. Kessler grew suspicious, but also intrigued. The prisoner spoke of a new Allied plan, a supposed push toward the east bank of the Seine. He mentioned supply depots near Évreux, armored divisions moving south of Paris, and a false timeline that suggested the Allies were overextending their lines. Everything he said sounded plausible. Too plausible. When Kessler's reports reached division command, they caused a stir. The intelligence suggested that the Allies might be preparing to flank German forces along a route they believed secure. Orders shifted. Units redeployed. Anti-tank guns were moved from the north to the south, leaving gaps that would soon prove catastrophic. And through it all, the American prisoner sat quietly in his cell, staring through the barred window at the rain, unaware that his deliberate or instinctive performance was setting into motion a chain of errors that would cost the Germans thousands of men. The war was no longer just being fought with tanks and rifles. It was being fought with information and misinformation, and in this shadow war of intelligence, one captured soldier had just become the most dangerous weapon of all. In every war, courage wears many faces. Some men show it in the roar of battle, charging across open ground under fire. Others show it in silence, sitting under a bare light bulb, facing an enemy who wants to dismantle their mind piece by piece. The captured American soldier represented that second kind of courage. He had no weapon, no platoon beside him, no hope of escape. Yet in that small room surrounded by enemies, he found a different kind of power: control over information. He knew that one wrong word could send entire Allied units into ambush, and one careful lie could do the same to the Germans. He played the role of the compliant prisoner perfectly. Not defiant, not broken cooperative enough to be convincing. Every pause, every breath, every nervous glance was part of a subtle performance. The Germans saw weakness. What they didn't see was calculation. This wasn't heroism in the traditional sense. It was something colder, quieter, the ability to think under pressure so intense that most men cracked. In that silence, courage wasn't measured in bullets fired, but in truths withheld. To understand the importance of that interrogation, one must look at the battlefield chessboard of August 1944. The Allies were tightening the noose around German forces trapped in the Falaise pocket, a massive encirclement forming in northern France. The Germans needed clarity. Were the Americans pressing toward Paris, or swinging east to cut off retreating divisions? Every miscalculation could mean encirclement. The false intelligence fed by the captured soldier played directly into this uncertainty. By suggesting an Allied concentration near Évreux and a weaker push toward Argenton, he redirected German focus southward exactly away from the real Allied axis of advance. This wasn't blind luck. American field manuals had long emphasized operational deception, the art of manipulating enemy expectations through subtle cues. Even ordinary soldiers were briefed in controlled misinformation, learning how to sprinkle harmless lies that would waste enemy resources. The Germans acted on his fabricated report, diverting reconnaissance units and delaying a counterattack that might have slowed the Allied advance. The result was tactical paralysis, a battlefield blinded by its own assumptions. Every interrogation was a duel not of weapons, but of will. The Germans relied on exhaustion, repetition, and emotional manipulation. They played good cop, bad cop. They lied about captured comrades. They used long silences to make men speak just to fill the air. But this soldier turned their own tactics against them. When they leaned in with kindness, he leaned back with trust, feeding them just enough truth to make them feel victorious. When they applied pressure, he showed vulnerability, letting them believe he was breaking. He became a mirror for their expectations, reflecting what they wanted to see. Psychologically, it was brilliant. He controlled the rhythm of the conversation, deciding when it rose and fell. The interrogators believed they were leading him. In reality, he was leading them. It's one of war's strangest paradoxes. Silence and deception can sometimes achieve what entire divisions cannot. In this case, one calm, unarmed man in a chair achieved what artillery could not. He moved the enemy. The Germans left that room believing they had extracted gold. In truth, they had been handed a weapon one aimed squarely at themselves, and so, while tanks clashed and planes roared overhead, a quieter battle was being fought in that dim farmhouse. A battle for control of perception itself, and the man who won it never fired a single shot. To the Germans, interrogation was not merely procedure. It was science. The Abwehr and the Gestapo believed they could read the human soul like a coded message. They studied micro-expressions, posture, breathing. They believed that fear made the truth inevitable. Hauptmann Erich Kessler, the officer leading the session, prided himself on precision. He had trained in Berlin, learning from psychologists and veteran interrogators who claimed to extract secrets without violence. For him, victory came from control, controlling tone, timing, and trust. But the war had eroded even that science. By 1944, German intelligence officers were no longer confident, composed men. They were exhausted, under pressure, and constantly looking over their shoulders. Failure could mean reassignment to the Eastern Front or worse. Their own lives depended on the quality of the information they produced. That desperation blinded them. When the American began to speak haltingly, convincingly, Kessler mistook cooperation for submission. He saw what he wanted to see, another frightened soldier, eager to trade truth for mercy. In reality, the American was running his own interrogation, feeding them pieces, watching their reactions, gauging what details they latched onto. Kessler had entered the room believing he held the power. By the time he left it, the prisoner did. Military history often glorifies the visible: tanks, planes, battles. But intelligence, invisible, psychological, and abstract, has destroyed more armies than artillery ever could. By mid-1944, the Allies were masters of deception. From Operation Fortitude, which convinced Hitler that the D-Day landings would occur at Pas-de-Calais, to the use of dummy divisions, fake radio chatter, and double agents like Garbo, the Western Allies had perfected the art of misinformation. The soldiers' deception in that farmhouse was not an isolated act. It was part of a wider philosophy that ran through Allied strategy. They understood that truth could kill, and lies could save lives. What made this interrogation unique was that it wasn't planned by high command. There was no elaborate script, no radio play. It was improvised intelligence born from instinct. A single man acting under extreme duress applied the same psychological principles that had guided entire Allied operations. And it worked. German signals intercepted from late August 1944 show sudden redeployments of units along the Seine sector, precisely the area mentioned in the prisoner's fabricated report. While historians can't confirm every detail, the pattern fits the timeline. German divisions shifted south, while Allied forces advanced through the very corridors the enemy had just weakened. In intelligence terms, it was the perfect false positive, the enemy reacting not to what was real, but to what seemed real. War bends morality into strange shapes. Deception, which in peace is condemned, becomes a necessity in war. To mislead the enemy is not treachery, it's strategy. But even so, there is an uncomfortable truth beneath the triumph. The captured soldier's victory was built on trust, the same trust his captors thought they were exploiting. In that room, both sides were liars. Both believed their cause justified their deceit. And both were, in their own ways, human. When Kessler finally left that room, he noted in his report that the American had been broken. He believed he had extracted the truth. He likely felt relief, perhaps even pride, that his method still worked amid the crumbling chaos of war. Days later, when German positions collapsed along the route his prisoner had described, he must have realized the enormity of his error, but by then it was too late. The truth had already done its damage. This raises the question that lingers over all intelligence work. Can a lie, even one told for a noble cause, ever be entirely clean? For the Americans who later read the interrogation transcripts after liberation, there was admiration, but also discomfort. Here was a man who had weaponized trust itself. His deception had saved lives, but it had also turned humanity's oldest bond truth into a battlefield tool. And yet, in that moral grayness lay the essence of modern warfare. Wars were no longer won only by strength or courage, but by the manipulation of perception. Victory belonged to those who could shape what the enemy believed. From the outside, the interrogation appeared in a small room. One officer, one prisoner. But in truth, it was a reflection of the entire war itself. A conflict fought not only across continents, but inside the human mind, and soon, that mental duel would reach its turning point, when the consequences of one man's deception would explode far beyond the walls of that farmhouse. The morning after the interrogation, the farmhouse was quiet. Only the creak of boots and the soft hum of a generator broke the silence. On a wooden table, a single report lay freshly typed, stamped, Dringend Hochgeheim Urgent Top Secret. It carried Hauptmann Kessler's signature and the prisoner's supposed confession. Within hours, that report was transmitted through field channels to Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who at that moment was trying to prevent total disaster in northern France. The report described what appeared to be credible intelligence, that U.S. forces were massing for an eastward thrust toward the Seine crossings near Évreux, aiming to cut German retreat routes before they could regroup. To Kluge and his staff, it seemed logical. It fit the pattern of earlier Allied moves. And above all, it matched what they feared most. The supposed confirmation from an American POW gave the fear legitimacy. By midday, staff officers began redrawing defensive lines on their maps. Reserve units, already low on fuel and ammunition, were ordered to reposition southward to block the anticipated Allied advance. It was a fatal decision, because the real Allied push wasn't coming from the south. It was coming from the west, fast, concentrated, and relentlessly spearheaded by Patton's Third Army sweeping across France in one of the most rapid armored advances of the war. The ripple effect of that one false report spread like cracks in glass. By the time the Germans realized their mistake, their defensive sectors had become disjointed. Bridges that should have been blown were left intact. Supply convoys moved in the wrong direction. Units that could have reinforced the Falaise Gap instead found themselves chasing a phantom offensive that never existed. In the small village of Nonancourt, south of the Seine, a German anti-tank battalion spent 3 critical days preparing for a major Allied thrust that never came. Meanwhile, 30 miles north, real American armored columns rolled through open roads nearly unopposed. It was chaos disguised as strategy, and it began with one man's deliberate misdirection. Inside the interrogation center, The American prisoner was still being held. He didn't know the full consequences of his deception, but he sensed something had changed. The guards were quieter, the officers more tense. He was moved to a new location, a railway depot outside Chartres, along with several other POWs. That same evening, as Allied artillery thundered closer, the Germans began burning documents. Among them were reports referencing his interrogation, but not before some copies were already sent east to command posts, intelligence bureaus, and finally, to Berlin. Historians later pieced together fragments of those transmissions through Allied signal intercepts and captured German archives. The language was technical, but the essence clear. Enemy soldier confirms large armored concentration south of Seine-Axis. Movements consistent with U.S. Droiderie Corps advance. Countermeasures advised immediately. That message, sent to at least 2 divisional headquarters, led to the redeployment of elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, one of the last capable armored units still functioning in France. Those tanks were moved away from their defensive position north of Argentan, leaving a gap that the Allies exploited days later to close the Falaise pocket. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped. Artillery and airstrikes tore through the congested roads as retreating columns tried to escape through the bottleneck. The result was catastrophic, and among the countless reasons for that disaster lay a single falsehood born in a dim interrogation room. For the Germans, the moment of realization came too late. When reports from the front contradicted the prisoners' claims, Kessler's superiors dismissed them, at first believing the units had simply failed to detect the full Allied thrust. Only when the encirclement became undeniable did they revisit the interrogation notes. There, among the tidy German phrases, one comment stood out, a small parenthetical remark written in Kessler's own hand. The prisoner displayed signs of fatigue, likely truthful in statements provided. It was a fatal assumption one officer's misplaced confidence immortalized in ink. For the Allies, the deception went unnoticed at the time. No one knew that a captured American soldier, alone and improvising, had helped mislead an entire section of the German command. The victory at Falaise would be remembered as a triumph of mobility, coordination, and courage, and it was. But behind that triumph lay dozens of invisible victories like this one, born not on the battlefield, but in the quiet war of minds. The interrogation that began as a test of endurance had now become a weapon of war, one that had already drawn blood. And yet the story was not finished. Because even as German forces reeled from the consequences of their own belief, the man who had planted that seed of deception was still deep in enemy hands, facing the next chapter of his silent battle for survival. The following days blurred into noise and movement engines, boots, distant explosions. The American prisoner, still shackled, heard the shifting thunder of artillery echoing across the countryside. The war was moving closer. German officers spoke in hurried tones, the confidence from earlier replaced by anxiety. What had once been an orderly retreat was now disintegrating. The deception he had set in motion had taken on a life of its own. Orders contradicted orders. Units that should have been reinforcing northern defenses were instead racing south, trying to counter a phantom force that did not exist. At headquarters near Chartres, staff officers gathered around a cluttered table, trying to make sense of reports that no longer matched reality. Patrols sent toward the supposed Évreux offensive found empty roads. Aerial reconnaissance revealed nothing. Still, senior officers refused to believe they'd been misled. Pride, protocol, and fear prevented them from admitting the truth. They had acted on false intelligence. In war, perception becomes momentum, and momentum is hard to stop. The turning point came on August 20, 1944, when the encirclement of the Falaise pocket was finally sealed. More than 50,000 German troops were trapped in a shrinking corridor of fire and smoke. Allied artillery pounded the roads from Troon to Chambois. The air was thick with the stench of burning vehicles and the cries of men trying to escape. The German command structure collapsed under the weight of its own miscalculations. Field Marshal von Kluge, unable to explain the disaster to Berlin, was recalled and later took his own life. The remnants of his division streamed eastward in chaos, leaderless, starving, hunted from the air. Among the reports recovered by Allied intelligence in the aftermath was one peculiar entry. An interrogation transcript marked, "Subject, American Reconnaissance Trooper." It contained the fabricated details that had contributed to the southern redeployment, a chain reaction that weakened the very corridor the Allies closed. No single lie wins a war, but this one has helped open the door. Back in German custody, the prisoner noticed the change in tone. Kessler no longer questioned him. The officer avoided eye contact, his earlier certainty replaced by a strained politeness. When he finally entered the cell again, his voice was quieter, less confident. "You misled us," he said flatly. The American didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the sound of artillery grew louder each hour. Columns of smoke rose from the horizon, Allied armor approaching fast. The farmhouse that had once been a place of control was now a bunker of fear. Files were burned, radios destroyed, officers fled in trucks that would never make it to safety. That night, during a hurried evacuation, the prisoners were marched east. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others slipped away in the confusion. When U.S. infantry units reached the area 2 days later, they found the farmhouse abandoned, rooms stripped bare, only fragments of paper swirling across the floor. Among them, one page survived the fire, a single paragraph of the interrogation summary, edges charred but legible. It ended with the line, "Prisoner's testimony consistent with known enemy tactics. Recommend verification by field patrol." The patrol was never sent. The front collapsed before the Germans could act. In the chaos of liberation, the American prisoner's fate was uncertain. Some accounts suggest he escaped during the evacuation, joining advancing Allied forces near Chartres. Others claim he was transferred deeper into Germany, his identity lost among thousands of captured men later liberated from Stalag camps in 1945. Whatever his end, the impact of his deception survived in the war diaries and intercepted orders that historians later cross-referenced. The pattern was clear. One small distortion of truth had magnified into operational confusion, leading to real consequences on the battlefield. It is in this convergence between human instinct and military outcome that the story finds its climax. One man with nothing but his mind had altered the rhythm of war. For the Germans, it was a haunting lesson. The interrogation rooms they once saw as tools of domination had become traps of their own making. Their faith in their methods and their ability to read weakness had been turned against them. For the Allies, it was a quieter victory, one that would never appear in official communiques or headlines. It existed in the margins, a whisper of how courage could manifest not in action, but in deception. And when the smoke of Falaise cleared and the road to Paris lay open, the chain of command that had relied on a single flawed report faced a truth more painful than any defeat. They had believed what they most feared, and in doing so, destroyed themselves. The interrogation was over, but its echo carried far beyond the walls where it began. From that moment onward, intelligence officers across all armies would remember what had happened in that quiet farmhouse, how the power of belief, once misplaced, could ruin empires. The German interrogator would survive the war, tried years later as a witness in post-war debriefings. When asked if he remembered that American prisoner, he paused and said only, yes, he spoke little, but he changed everything. The lie had done its work. Now in the ruins of France, history was shifting, and a silent victory had already been won. By the time Allied convoys rolled through the shattered roads of northern France, the battle was no longer just about ground gained or enemy captured. It was about understanding why the German defense had collapsed so quickly, and how a single prisoner's words had rippled across the entire front. In late August 1944, when the Falaise pocket finally closed, Allied intelligence teams began combing through abandoned German command posts. Inside ruined chateaus and makeshift bunkers, they uncovered maps, encoded messages, and interrogation reports of fragments of a collapsing machine. Among them, the document marked Interrogation of U.S. Reconnaissance Trooper, 12th August 1944 stood out. Its contents had been passed upward through German channels from a local counterintelligence unit to the Army group level and cited in several redeployment orders. The Allies, reconstructing the timeline, realized that misinformation from a single interrogation had played a small but pivotal role in convincing the Germans to divert critical reserves southward, weakening the corridor at Falaise. That meant the deception, born in a dim interrogation room, had indirectly helped close one of the most decisive traps of the Western Front. The story spread quietly among intelligence officers not as a public triumph, but as a professional curiosity. The British MI-19 and the American G2 branches examined the transcript, comparing it with their own methods of interrogation resistance training. The conclusion was understated but significant. Psychological deception, when executed by instinct and discipline, could rival any weapon on the battlefield. For the men in the field, though, the victory had a different flavor. In the villages liberated from German occupation, soldiers found barns full of burned papers and abandoned vehicles. They had no idea that somewhere in those ashes lay the evidence of one man's courage under pressure. His name never made it into official citations. No medal was issued, yet his influence rippled through the ranks of those who studied the war afterward. In post-war debriefings, Allied analysts described the Falaise intelligence breakdown as a cascade of assumption errors. They noted how a single misinterpretation validated by false interrogation data could distort an entire operational picture. For the Germans, whose wartime doctrine depended heavily on precise, centralized control, such confusion was fatal. Once corrupted information entered their system, the entire structure wobbled. Meanwhile, the German officers who had participated in the interrogation faced their own reckoning. By 1946, during Allied intelligence interviews at Camp O20 in Britain and Augsburg in Germany, several admitted their overconfidence in interrogation results. One former Abwehr officer described it as the arrogance of certainty, believing that fear could always extract truth. That assumption had failed them. Historians later identified the psychological pattern behind it. When interrogators expect deceit, they read honesty as resistance. When they expect weakness, they read silence as defiance. The American prisoner had instinctively exploited this paradox. He had told them exactly what they wanted to hear, just enough to confirm their fears. The U.S. Army, learning from the event, revised portions of its POW resistance training manuals in 1945-46. The new guidance emphasized control through confusion, teaching soldiers to offer limited, misleading details that could safely be misinterpreted by the enemy. Though the manuals never cited specific cases, veterans who served in France recognized the inspiration behind the change. By the war's end, Germany's intelligence structure was a shadow of its former self. The Abwehr had been absorbed, dismantled, and replaced by the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, an organization more focused on internal purges than external truth. The cost of misplaced belief had been catastrophic. In the ruins of Normandy, the farmhouse that once held the interrogation decayed into silence. Villagers who returned after the war found the structure burned, its cellar filled with rainwater and broken glass. But beneath the rubble, Allied teams found remnants of German paperwork, pieces of carbon copy sheets, names half erased, dates barely legible. Among them, one fragment carried a note scrawled in pencil. The subject maintains a confident, unshakable story. It was the last surviving trace of the soldier whose endurance had altered the outcome of a campaign. His name was never confirmed in any official archive. Some historians suggest he belonged to the 2nd Armored Division, others to the reconnaissance troop of the 30th Infantry Division, both units that fought near Argentan that week. But regardless of identity, the act remained a symbol of how intelligence, courage, and silence could shape victory as surely as bullets and bombs. And yet, even as Allied historians celebrated the success of Operation Cobra and the closing of the Falaise pocket, they recognized that the most powerful victories of war are often invisible. They happen not on the map, but in the human mind, where one decision can bend the fate of armies. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, armies counted their dead, cities counted their ruins, and intelligence officers counted their mistakes. Every side had stories of triumph and failure in the shadow world of information. But in the US and Britain, one lesson stood out with quiet certainty. Truth in war was never absolute, and belief was as lethal a weapon as any rifle. The episode of the captured American reconnaissance soldier became an internal case study, not in heroism, but in methodology. Within the U.S. War Department's Intelligence Division, analysts dissected the interrogation transcript, tracing how the prisoner's misinformation had been validated by German officers higher up the chain. The conclusion was profound. Even a perfect intelligence apparatus collapses when it begins to trust its own assumptions more than its evidence. In post-war Europe, the Allies began compiling their lessons learned archives, massive collections of documents, interviews, and captured records designed to inform future generations. Inside one of these files, labeled Psychological Warfare and Counterintelligence Western Front 1944, the case appeared in a small footnote. Instance of prisoner deception leading to erroneous redeployment of enemy reserves. Demonstrates the potential of controlled misinformation under interrogation. It was a single paragraph in a 1,000-page report, but to the strategists of the Cold War that followed, it was gold. The newly formed Office of Strategic Services, OSS, soon to evolve into the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, studied such events to understand human behavior under pressure. The idea that an individual could reshape outcomes through controlled deception became central to later doctrines of counterintelligence and psychological operations. Meanwhile, in Germany's post-war reckoning, surviving officers of the Abwehr and SS intelligence branches were interrogated by Allied investigators. When asked about the breakdown of their analytical reliability in 1944, many admitted that their interrogation processes were too confident, too dependent on fear. They had measured truth by emotion, and in doing so, they had been manipulated by the very terror they inflicted. It was a bitter irony. The machinery of coercion had been undone by a man with nothing left but his will. In 1948, during testimony at the Nuremberg military tribunals, a former counterintelligence officer described it simply, "We believed the prisoner's calmness was guilt. We did not understand that calmness can also be discipline." That single observation became a line quoted in military training manuals for decades. By the early 1950s, the United States began codifying SEER survival, evasion resistance, and escape training for airmen and special operations troops. Embedded in its philosophy was the same principle demonstrated in that Normandy farmhouse. Control the narrative. Give the enemy what confirms his bias. Never show fear. Few recruits knew that part of the doctrine came from a nameless soldier's wartime defiance, but his ghost lingered in every classroom, every simulation, every whispered scenario where survival depended not on strength but on deception. For historians, the episode also exposed something deeper, the fragility of truth in war. Intelligence, they learned, was never just about gathering facts. It was about interpreting emotion, filtering bias, and surviving pressure. The prisoner's story illustrated how easily truth could bend under fear, and how one man's understanding of that fact could shift the balance between victory and disaster. The Germans had built one of the most methodical intelligence systems in the world, supported by cryptographers, interrogators, and analysts. Yet that system collapsed not from a lack of data but from misplaced certainty. They believed they could read men. They could not. In the years that followed, as Europe rebuilt and new wars emerged in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, the legacy of those wartime lessons persisted. Every army learned to prepare its soldiers not just for combat, but for capture to weaponize silence and misinformation, just as effectively as bullets. And in intelligence schools from Fort Huachuca to Sandhurst, the case of the unnamed American prisoner was still cited stripped of identity, but preserved as doctrine, because in the end, his story was not about one man outsmarting his captors. It was about the psychology of power and the courage to control a narrative even when stripped of everything else. The war is long over now. The battlefields where nations once clashed are quiet fields again scattered with wildflowers, stone markers, and the ghosts of memory. The farmhouse is gone, the reports forgotten, the names erased by time. But the lesson remains. In every war, the fiercest battles are not always fought with guns. Sometimes they unfold in silence in the mind of one man deciding what he will or will not say. The captured American soldier who sat beneath a single hanging light in 1944 may never have imagined that his words, measured and deliberate, would ripple through history. Yet in that moment, stripped of weapon, rank, and freedom, he proved that the most powerful act of resistance is control. His story reminds us that truth in war is never static. It bends under fear. It shifts under pressure, and it survives only when held with discipline. The Germans sought to break him with certainty, but it was their certainty that broke them. In the decades that followed, Armies would learn to train soldiers not only to fight, but to think under capture, to wield deception as defense, to understand that silence could protect more lives than bullets ever could. What began as one man's defiance became a doctrine. And what began as a whisper in a cell became a warning across generations. Power can command obedience, but it cannot command truth. The nameless prisoner never sought glory. His victory was invisible, one no medal could honor, no monument could capture. Yet in the vast story of World War II, his quiet courage endures as a testament to the mind's ability to outlast fear. Because in the end, wars are not only decided by armies or machines, but by the human will, by the choices made when no one is watching. And sometimes, history turns not with a roar of guns, but with the calm, steady voice of a man